Okay, thanks, Jonica. Can everybody hear okay? Jonica was having problems. Anybody else having any issues?
I can hear you okay.
Okay, then we'll get started. Thanks again, everybody, for coming. This is the last meeting for this stakeholder group, and then we'll turn things over to the SCC to complete the study. So a reminder, this is all the groups that are participating, and we just ask that as you unmute to speak today, you just give your name and organization. And if we move on to our agenda for today. Are you able to advance the slides, Janica? There we go. Well, anyway, I'll get started. So our agenda for today, we were going to kick it off with a presentation on carbon leakage, but our presenter was unavailable. So they're going to send some materials later that we'll include with the final submission to the SCC. But we are going to give an opportunity if anyone else has any views on carbon leakage that they want to share. We'll start off with a discussion there. After that, we'll go over the draft report really today, focusing on the recommendations. Then we'll hear from the SCC just about how the rest of this study will play out, and then we'll close it out. So could you advance to carbon leakage, please, Janica? Second. So Janica's teeing that up. Again, so we don't have a presenter, but we have a sort of basic definition of what we mean by carbon leakage. So that's something that occurs when businesses and jurisdictions with stringent environmental regulations are forced to move production to regions with less stringent rules due to compliance costs, resulting in little to no net reduction in overall emissions. That's from one of our regulatory assessment submissions. And then this issue of carbon leakage is directly addressed in the resolution. So one of the things the Commission shall do is consider whether and how these tools, meaning PBR alternative tools, assist in preventing carbon leakage from the manufacturing sector. So yeah, unfortunately, we don't have our full presentation, but did want to give an opportunity if on this issue of carbon leakage, there are any particular thoughts or comments anyone in the group would want to share. So does anyone have any views on carbon leakage and how performance-based or alternative tools may affect it? Okay. Well, as we said, this will be addressed in the Commission study, so they'll be able to dive in a little deeper. All right. With that, Johnny, if we could move on to the draft report review that we're going to do today. And just apologies that we were a little later circulating this report than we intended to be. We had some just time constraints on our end over the past week, and we are continuing to work on the formatting and language consistency, things like that, on the presentation of it and the tone. So as you're reviewing, don't worry about that. We'll keep working. We're mostly asking the group to focus on making sure the report is accurate, and then that these recommendations that we run through today are reflective of what the group's work has been. So just before we get into these recommendations specifically, just as previously mentioned, the entire record of the stakeholder process, including presentations, comment letters, pretty much everything that's on our website, that will all be submitted to the Commission for their consideration. This report that we're looking at today, this is meant to provide a summary of the process that we've been through over the last couple of months, and then also capture the recommendations from this group to the Commission as the Commission completes its overall study. And I also think as we finish our formatting, we'll add references to the various appendices in our summary, and hopefully that'll act as a way for anyone reading to navigate all the material we've collected over the last few months. So as mentioned, today's discussion is going to focus on the recommendations, but we would ask that you review the report as you have time to ensure that it accurately reflects discussions and especially that it does not misrepresent any stakeholder's position. If you could let us know by the end of the day on Thursday, if you see anything inaccurate, you can just send that to us in writing by email or give us a call, whatever works best for you. I know the report is almost 30 pages long, but I think you'll be able to skip some sections. You'll be able to tell which sections relate to your contributions and check those. So today we'll move through the recommendations one by one to check that they are reflective of the interests expressed over the course of the process and that they provide clear direction to the Commission on what we'd like to see in that final report, final study of theirs. And at the end, will be an opportunity also to see if there's any other recommendations that should be added. But before we sort of dive into going through these recommendations one by one, are there any questions at this point? Yeah, Joe?
Hey, Larry. Um, First of all, thanks as always to DOE for all the hard work that it has put into this stakeholder process. And I confess, having just gotten the report this morning and have been in a hearing today, that I haven't really gotten much beyond the recommendations. But I guess conceptually, a little bit of a concern on our part, centered around two things. One, as you note in the report, this is not intended to be recommendations coming from DOE.
Correct.
Right? They are recommendations coming from the stakeholder group. And in that respect, I go back to something you said, Larry, in one of our earlier meetings, where you made it clear that where there are consensus recommendations of the stakeholders, those consensus recommendations will be expressed to the commission. And, you know, I obviously am not privy to all the comments that parties have made throughout the process, but my perception, our perception is there are very few, if any, consensus recommendations of the 38 stakeholders to this process. And a further perception is that, you know, there are some stakeholders that are were very vocal advocates of particular positions. And I would say that you know, the utilities, the two utilities were very consistent in a lot of their positions. And then on the other end, there were a small number, in my estimation, of consistent commenters that you know, consumed a lot of the discussion time, but that there are many other stakeholders among the 38 groups represented in this process that were not necessarily on board with particular recommendations or points of view. You know, and maybe we're sort of scratching their heads on maybe this is right, maybe this is wrong throughout this process. And so I'm concerned that the way the recommendations are framed, that you know, DOE may be getting a little ahead of itself here in suggesting that they are, with due respect, that they are consensus recommendations, or, you know, even statements like a broad swath of stakeholders feel X or Y. Well, I mean, there's 38 stakeholders. Is it 2 or 3 that are vocal on this, or is it really a, you know, a groundswell of support for the commission evaluating X or Y? So I was a little surprised by the structure of the recommendations, and I was surprised by the substance of some of the recommendations, which I don't believe represent a consensus of the group.
Yeah, well, I'll address your 2 points, and I would be interested if you could give a little more specificity, maybe just pick one and kind of walk through it. But I agree. I mean, part of today is to see if there's consensus on these recommendations. And we did try to write them broadly, but I think they are mostly addressing what we would like the commission to study further, and without trying to tilt the scale to a result, saying, stakeholders have raised concerns in this area, but, it is not a consensus view that this is a problem. The SDC should establish if there is a problem and things of that nature. Then I was, when we get into the going through one by one, you're right about the structure. We have put kind of a few bullet points in each of how we, the broad viewpoints that went into the recommendations. And one thing I did want to put to the group is whether that's something we should actually keep in the final report. We kept it in here just to help everybody navigate, where did we come from when we put these together? What viewpoints were we trying to coalesce when we came up with each of these recommendations? So that is certainly something we can take out if that is not helpful, or if it seems to be preferential to a certain viewpoint. But I would be interested to maybe hear one or two of the specific, or maybe it's easier to do it as we go through, but to hear a little more specificity to understand your views on the recommendations and how you think they may be skewed.
Sure. I mean, we can do it as we go through, or pick one or two. Like it says, the stakeholder group recommends that the commission study fuel cost sharing as a PBR tool. I don't think there's consensus among 38 stakeholders that the commission should study fuel cost sharing at all, right? And there's some pretty strong views that that's a bad idea, right? And that it doesn't lead to good results for customers. And so that's one example where, I think it's accurate to say there was a discussion about that, and a limited number of stakeholders may believe that it's worthy of commission study, and others believe that it's not. The way it's phrased, it is an affirmative. It is effectively represented as this is a recommendation from the group that this should be studied.
Understood. And I think we can look at that one. And that one, as I'm looking at it again, maybe a little superfluous given that fuel cost sharing is mentioned in the resolution itself. We just had seen it, especially in some of the later comments and assessments that came in, it had come up as a point of interest. But certainly as we go through one by one, we can see if it's a fair inclusion.
I mean, I think, just generally, and then I will be quiet. Certainly I think it is valuable to present to the commission what appears to be in the first 30 pages, 28 pages of the report, which is a discussion, a fulsome discussion of the process, who participated, quite a bit of feedback on various stakeholder positions. But I mean, from the company's standpoint, I would hope that anything that comes across as a recommendation is very carefully framed, and it's accurate in terms of whose recommendation is this. Because when you made the comment, Larry, of if there are consensus recommendations, we'll present them. If there aren't, then we won't. I mean, I sort of said, well, I don't think we're going to have a lot of consensus recommendations among 38 stakeholder groups, and I don't think we do. We want this report to be helpful to the commission, but obviously they are going to take a fresh look at this in every respect with the assistance of the staff. And again, I just think we need to be very circumspect about what if anything, this group is formally recommending to the commission.
Understood. And I mean, if your point is well taken, is there another way you would suggest framing some of these? I mean, because we can, add additional categories. We can have consensus recommendations, other recommendations. I think I've seen that in some previous reports others have done.
Sure. It's a great thought, Larry. I'll confess, in 5 hours, I haven't thought through, and I'm not criticizing the timing of you sharing it with us. It's just the calendar is what it is. But I think we can talk it through today. From the company standpoint, we might have some recommendations on alternative ways to frame this that perhaps is a little more precise.
Yeah, well, that would be great. That's exactly what we want to do. So appreciate as we do go through them one by one, if you can kind of highlight the concerns of the language or the presentation.
Sure.
Right, I think Christian, you're next.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. This is Christian Tucker on behalf of the Virginia Committee and Old Dominion Committee for Fair Utility Rates. I have a specific change that somewhat related to Mr. Reed's point. Page 4 of the report, there's some language that notes that the views expressed and aren't necessarily representative of the Virginia Department of Energy. I would like that to be expanded to make reference that it is not necessarily representative of any individual stakeholder. I understand that part of the reasoning for this is to get some consensus around certain recommendations, but I think having that be clear that even if there is consensus, that does not mean that by merely participating as part of this group, we agree with the consensus or any individual recommendation. And then the other point is particularly for the committees, this has been a point that we've expressed throughout this process, is we've discussed these tools in the abstract, which has, just by virtue of the discussion and how we've done it, does not include the rate impacts of these tools, or what these rate impacts would be if any individual tool would increase rates, decrease rates, what they would be. For the committees, that's a very important consideration. And so understanding that skepticism and having that be included as part of fairly stated in the report, and that any stakeholder position may be reserved until knowing the rate impact. Understanding, a lot of these recommendations are for further study, further inquiry. That's very good. I think the committee wants to make sure, and the committees want to make sure, that by virtue of participating in this process, we have not expressed our final opinion or view on any individual PBR tool that is discussed in the stakeholder report. These are, I think, hopefully some changes that are be acceptable to the group, allow everybody some flexibility moving forward, and not necessarily feel tied down to the views or recommendations expressed in this report as we learn more about the various tools.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a very good point. And to the page 4 paragraph, we can certainly add something that any views are not ascribed to a individual stakeholder unless specifically stated, because obviously we have people's presentations and things in there, and we can definitely add some sort of caveat to the recommendation section along the lines you've mentioned.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Christian. And then Lena. Sorry, was it not Lena? Oh, yes. Sorry, you're on mute, Lena.
Hi, Lena Lewis with the Nature Conservancy. Appreciate the comments so far, and so appreciate the report. And of course, same caveat as the others. I haven't had time to read it thoroughly, but definitely, don't want to imply consensus where there isn't. At the same time, I don't think there is a need to have a report that essentially is devoid of content for lack of consensus. And so I think we do want to find a way to state what was the substance of our discussions. And I think within that, the recommendations are for what we are recommending is studied by the SEC, not what we are recommending the SEC should implement as policy. And so it seemed to me in reading the report that the recommendations for further study were based on what stakeholders in this group chose to bring forward as topics of particular interest or concern. And even if those topics were not brought up verbally in this meeting, there were ample opportunities for all stakeholders to send in comments, fill in the worksheets, those sorts of things. And it seemed to me that that's where a lot of the conclusions came from in terms of what the recommendations for further study were coming from. So, I understand the comment that some people are more vocal than others, but that I don't think that means that people were. I don't think that means that people were silent because they were confused. I think if people's opinions weren't put forward, it's because they chose not to put them forward. And so let's figure out a way to make sure that the ideas that were brought forward as concerns in the stakeholder group are properly expressed in this report as ideas that the SEC should just study. That's all we're saying, study. Thanks.
Thanks, Lena. And certainly I think you've captured very well what our intent was in putting those together to try and just address areas where there had been discussion, both in these meetings and through the various other forms of submission that we've had, and say these are the places that further study may be warranted. Okay, thanks. Victoria?
Yeah, thank you. Broadly, I agree with Lena's comments. I also think the sort of diversity of opinion in terms of which tools merit further study is represented in the graphics there that show survey responses and the total number of stakeholders that expressed an interest in further study for any particular tool is shown there. So again, don't want to misrepresent consensus, but I do think it is important to demonstrate, in addition to those graphics, the general direction of conversation. So mostly echoing Lena's comments.
Thank you. All right. Well, before we start going through these one by one, does anyone else have any comments, questions? Okay, and I would suggest,
Larry,
just
real quick.
Sorry, go ahead.
I figured I'd jump in. This is John Stevens with APCO, and I'm just going to kind of echo some of Joe Reed's sentiments. Not surprising to anybody, I wouldn't think, but I mean, I realize we don't want a report that's devoid of any kind of information. I get that, but my thought is it's kind of misleading to the commission maybe to say the stakeholder group thinks it should study this or that when there's certain parties in the stakeholder group that may not think that. So, my thought would be, if we want to have the extra information in there, then probably the best thing to do would be to make it more granular, lay out specifically who supports what. I realize it'd make the report a little bit longer, but I think that would be more informative to the commission, so that when they see a recommendation, they know exactly, who supports that recommendation and who may not.
Understood. So, Katja, I see you're next.
Yeah, thank you, Larry and Jonica, for this report. It was really helpful to read through and have a good recap of the process so far. I do think I want to echo Lena and Victoria's comments in that I think one of the early goals that we set on, we talked about what we wanted to come out of the stakeholder process was to make it easier for the SEC to identify priorities that are outlined in the enabling legislation. And so I think some of what I imagine some of the intent, Larry and Jonica and you trying to put these recommendations together is to give the SEC a sense of which tools and performance areas in the enabling legislation that has already been mandated, which of those the SEC should maybe prioritize as far as stakeholders' interest in which we're discussed, not necessarily to recommend which one should be implemented. And I think for that reason, it could be helpful to have this framing of recommendations for particular tools of interest, because those were the tools that were discussed most amongst the stakeholders. Stakeholders had the most questions about and were identified as maybe some of the tools that were of common usage in other states that have implemented PBR. And so, yeah, I would just say that I think some of these recommendations are helpful as far as a roadmap for the SEC study for the tools that have already been mandated in the legislation to be considered.
Thanks. And if anyone does have a way, if there's a way we could frame these at the middle ground, that we're trying to reflect where the main discussion points and maybe somewhere where the main differences were, but without ascribing any particular viewpoint on how those studies should, how the SEC's further evaluations should conclude, or what we would expect them to conclude. Feel free to offer suggestions. And I see, Joe, I see your hand up.
Yeah, and I know I've already had a turn, but something John said struck a chord with me. Again, I think being precise here is real important, and the data is very precise, right? The surveys, this percentage of stakeholders identified this issue as their number one priority. Second in priority was this, third in priority is this. These are the results of the surveys, which show where parties believe the system is working or broken, et cetera. So, I think the data is very helpful to the commission, but, the very first bullet under recommendations says that the meeting and comments submitted by the stakeholder group exposed dissatisfaction among many groups with the current regulatory structure for a variety of reasons. That is a mighty, mighty, mighty broad statement. And the second and third bullets put forward the IOU's positions, which I think were pretty accurately described. But it would be very easy for the commission or some other reader of this report, phrased like that, to say, just about everybody thinks the system is broken except for the IOUs. And I don't think that's accurate. And I think that, again, we probably just need a little bit more precision and fact-based reporting to the commission.
Understood. And if those sort of introductory bullets are a primary issue, we can definitely take those out. Those were just meant to be a guide to where the recommendations came from. But
Sure.
Ultimately, the recommendations flow from everything we've done. And your point on surveys is well taken. We were just, understanding that people at different times have been able to participate at different levels. We were trying not to focus just on a single survey or two. I also think with people written in their comments and regulatory assessments, we were trying to collect that as well when we considered what might be the higher interest areas for study. But I think broadly what we've got here should be pretty reflective of the couple of surveys that are represented in the summary, the two surveys we've done. All right. Well, does anybody have any objection to us taking out those introductory bullets and just shaving the recommendations down to the recommendation bullets themselves? Really, all that material described there is ultimately in the record elsewhere. Yeah, Rachel.
Hey, Larry. Rachel with the Southern Environmental Law Center. I was starting to type a comment, but thank you for welcoming verbal input. I think to the extent many is really just reflecting most or the majority of, like if that is meant to represent some sort of numerical balance of interests that were represented, perhaps a slight changing of verbiage could do. I have not read all the detail of all the submissions that you all received. So to the extent those bullets reflect the collection of information you all have received and reviewed and is meant to sort of showcase where most of certain types of comments landed, I think perhaps some word changes could get a more detailed concept across if many is too vague. But in terms of taking it out entirely, if that is truly reflective of the information that you all have collected, then I don't know why we would strike it.
Well, I mean, is it serving a purpose in your opinion that wouldn't be served just by having the recommendations standing by themselves?
It strikes me as a purpose of like overall group sentiment. But that's what I'm saying. To the extent it represents some balance of interest, like the majority of participants said something, I think that's an informational data point worth noting. But it doesn't say majority of, so that's what I'm saying. Like if that is meant to indicate some, some level of difference of numeric representation of like who consistently said what, not identified the individual entities, but if it's meant to represent some numeric thing, that seems like a data point of interest. So I'm just sort of, if that's what's meant to be gotten at here, there might be some wordsmithing that can still get at that point that speaks more specifically to whether there's a majority or most of, as opposed to sort of a generalized many groups.
Yeah, and that is there's a challenge there in terms of who is participating. We have that very lengthy list of stakeholders participating. I think it's 30 plus, and then who responds to one of our surveys had 7 responses. I think the other had about 10. We had about 11 groups fill out the regulatory assessment. 5, I think, offered final comments for the final assessment. So in that sense, it is hard to be precise. So, I mean, that's reflective of what we received, but then there is that issue of if things were not submitted, how do you quantify that or include that in your calculation?
I see. And I'm seeing some chat comments as well that many is accurate. So like to the extent this reflects what you received, then perhaps the caveat is just that I just, to the extent there's some way to identify that like from what we received, this is the distillation, and acknowledge that like there are some entities that perhaps did not provide information or perhaps provided information but didn't speak to a certain section. That seems like distilling. My main point is that like if this reflects what you all got, I think the commission should know that. So I'm hesitant to strike something that reflects true content that was received.
Well, and this is where I would say, I mean, it does reflect what we received. I mean, maybe we could argue, but should many be some or a number of groups? But I mean, everything that's written in these introductory bullets is really reflected elsewhere in the summary or the record. So in that sense, it will be sent to the commission. And the other thing to bear in mind is that the commission and their consultants that they have engaged, they have been watching along and with us in every meeting, have been reviewing every submission. So they're also well aware of what has been submitted along the way. Yes, Laura?
Hi, everybody. Laura Gonzalez with Cullen, Virginia. Thank you, Larry. So maybe to address some of Mr. Reed's concerns, we could be a little bit more precise of which other groups express no concern about the current regulatory system. Maybe we could raise those voices a little bit better in the report. So maybe if there was any other group that submitted total satisfaction or submitted several positive feedback about the current system, maybe we could include it in an extra bullet point instead of striking the first bullet point that actually reflects that a certain number of groups or enough number of groups to make them many express concerns about the current system. Yeah,
and I think that drives slightly the same issue again of how do we account for people who said nothing, didn't express the opinion either way. We could have some introductory language with just that, it's based on submission we received, but that does not incorporate feedback from every stakeholder on every issue. Yeah, Lena?
Well, just a thought then that we could add a bullet point that says many groups expressed no opinion.
Yeah.
And I also like Laura's idea as well of putting an extra bullet point if there were other groups that expressed that there were no problems with the current system or that the current system is working well, but just a bullet point saying many groups expressed no opinion.
Yeah, I don't think we received many submissions in that nature. I think we had maybe one other respondent who was supportive of the cost of service model, but then that didn't necessarily have complete satisfaction of how that's applied in Virginia, to my recollection.
Okay, so when you said you didn't get many other responses that said the current system is satisfactory.
Not in whole.
Not to put you on the spot.
Sorry,
You don't have to have it all memorized.
Yeah,
but,
not in the wholesale way. Certainly at different
Yeah.
points, people said, we think this does work, we think this doesn't work. But I think it was only the investor-owned utilities who thought the current model was pretty good as is. Others, a lot of interest obviously in the other alternative tools, and then I think I said at least one respondent who I think satisfied with cost of service model, but I don't think that extended to complete satisfaction with the Virginia version of cost of service.
I was just clarifying that I wouldn't necessarily expect you to get a response that says no opinion. I would expect you to have, for people with no opinion, to just not send you anything.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think your suggestion's a good one. If we sort of make sure we note that the nature of our deliberations here, we haven't got everybody's opinion on everything.
I would just like to add that maybe we can also point out, we have mentioned that the number of responses we received for the surveys or the regulatory assessment or the final comments. We can maybe also add the language that out of the so many groups we received only so many responses or something like that, and that kind of gives a sense of how many people chose not to respond.
Yeah, and I see some mention in the chat of a poll, or maybe, okay, I think as written, it's maybe a follow-up survey. If we do want to maybe go through the recommendations today, we can send you out a survey, and over the next couple of days, people can kind of indicate whether they agree or not, and we can record it very much organization by organization, if that would work for everybody.
This is Carrie with the Commission on Electric Utility Regulation. I think, to the extent that you're able to provide an option where there's a neutral, no opinion or no response type option, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, we can do that. All right, Katja?
Yeah, I was just going to quickly say to the point of maybe some of the positive comments about the current regulatory system. I think that it'd be great to include some of those if you have information that's been provided to include. But I also would it be helpful maybe on the front end to include some framing about this report in the sense of this was an effort to identify room and areas for improvement in our current system, to evaluate the current mechanisms and if there's room for improvement or potential improvement through the use of lots of these other tools that we've been learning about. And so I think inherently the feedback that's going to be in the report will naturally kind of sway in the opinion of looking for better solutions, looking for alternative options than what we currently have, and offering maybe some critique or feedback on those systems. And so, I don't know if maybe it's just a kind of like a clarifying framing statement that makes that clear, because I think naturally the nature of this report is a task for looking for improvement, not necessarily to affirm all of the positives of the current system that we have, although it's always helpful to acknowledge that. But I think naturally the content of the report is going to sway in that light more so, and I don't think that that's inherently a negative thing or that it implies that there are no good qualities to the system whatsoever.
Thanks. That's actually a very good point, Kat. I mean, we are inherently looking at other models and potential areas for improvement, so there is potentially a natural skew. Seems to be a lot of support in the chat for having a follow-up survey and we're perfectly happy. We'll put that together. by the end of today, and once we'll still go through the recommendations to make sure everybody's satisfied with the language and everything's in there. But we can put out that survey with the option of, agree, disagree, or no opinion, and we can make sure that the final report labels them such we can kind of footnote each recommendation, I think, with the groups that supported it. So I see next up, Catch, is your hand still up from before? Okay, fine. And Christian, you're up next.
Yeah. So I think two comments. One is and again, may have missed it, but when it comes to accuracy, I think identifying the number of participants in the stakeholder group, the number of comments received, and the number of final assessments, I think would be helpful. And then to your point, and this is, I suppose, a lawyer thing, but there's three answers to a question usually: yes, no, or I don't know. And I don't know is a valid answer to that question. I think that this is not the proceeding to get anybody into a position that they are not otherwise willing to take, or don't feel they have enough information to take a position. And so the no opinion or needs more information, call it the third neutral option, I think should be expressed clearly, to the extent that it is either done through a survey or through just a clarification in the first several bullet points here of the current regulatory structure, that a number of participants did not express an opinion one way or another regarding the current regulatory structure and the various PBR tools that were discussed over the course of the stakeholder group.
Yeah, I think it sounds like most people are in agreement with that, and we can frame the survey in that way. Laura, you're next.
I was thinking if we were going to have time to just go, I mean, this recommendation section is relatively short, so if we could go through it just to see if there are questions about it, so when we respond to the survey, we have more clarity about what we're responding, and if there are concerns about particular recommendations, I think this is a good opportunity to hear from each other about it and just have a discussion about it.
Yeah, absolutely. But just before we do get to moving on, is there any objection to the notion that we'll go through these recommendations one by one today? We'll discuss them. Then we can put them in a survey, and everyone can give, I agree, I disagree, or I have no opinion on this, and we will reflect that in the, I think we'll probably footnote it, but we'll find some way to reflect that on the page here. And we can also tweak some of those introductory bullets to, reflect whatever numbers the survey shows support each position. All right, that sounds good to everybody. All right. All right. Well, no, really appreciate everybody giving this such consideration. And then we will, so now we'll move on to looking at these one by one. And I think we've already discussed everything I wanted to say in advance, so I'll just go through. So the first one, the current regulatory structure, this was something we focused on a lot. We had a couple of extended discussions on this. So first recommendation, Commission should address whether the areas of concern identified by stakeholders in surveys, comments, and discussions have clear scope for improvement based on reasonable comparisons. And then we just a couple of examples. That could be energy costs in neighboring states, energy efficiency program accomplishments in other places, just whatever's a fair comparison for the particular performance area. So just any opinions on this first recommendation? I mean, the idea here is that where possible, a commission can say, can we really improve the performance here? And then obviously that can lead into how you consider the different structures that may apply. All right. Then the next one, we had heard in some of the comments Oh, sorry, go ahead, Joe.
I mean, I guess we're happy to give you some specific feedback on these, but is the point here that the commission should address whether the areas of concern have clear scope for improvement based on potential changes in the construct, or are we saying that you should look at energy costs in neighboring states, which we compare very favorably to, and energy efficiency and so forth, and the commission should decide, should we change things to try to be more like these neighboring states? I guess I was a little confused as to what the point was.
Yeah, well, I think this was just very broadly to more so to the latter point that you made. It's more about looking at what is possible, looking at neighboring states, but we appreciate there are different models, different circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So looking at energy costs and saying, not just does state X, state Y have higher or lower rates, but is there places they are performing better than Virginia, based on everything else that goes in there? Could Virginia be making comparable improvements in their energy costs? Similarly to energy efficiency programs, if energy efficiency programs have been much more broadly adopted in other states, is there a reason Virginia could not have similar accomplishments? And that's why we use the word reasonable comparisons, to let the commission decide what's fair, not inherently say that one state is doing better than Virginia just because it has lower energy costs. There may be other reasons for that besides the regulatory structure.
So essentially it's saying, take a look at other states with alternative regulatory structures and decide whether there's room for improvement in Virginia based on how those states are doing.
I wouldn't, as written, we had not really even considered looking at necessarily, entirely the regulatory structure, just saying, because that may not be the only factor. It's just saying, are other states in the performance areas that have been identified as priority, are other states or just other places, are they doing better? I mean, is there obviously a way that performance could be superior? I mean, because you can say anything can be better, but is it reasonable to say that in Virginia we could improve performance in this area?
Okay, so it's essentially saying, benchmark our utilities on reliability, rates, sustainability, increasingly clean. Benchmark us. How are we doing relative to other states? And is there room for clear scope for improvement?
Yes, that's the intention.
That's an easy one.
That's right, and I think with all of these, we'll have to appreciate that to some extent the commission is going to, like our group, they're going to have limited time and resources. So a lot of these recommendations are meant to guide where we think they should maybe use their time. And in other places, the commission itself, I think, will have to determine what's reasonable and the time that they have available.
Got it.
And so, Victoria, see you next.
Yeah, just noting the way I read it is basically making sure the commission does a gut check on whether any areas of study recommended are coming completely out of left field and there's going to be no way to do any sort of measurable comparison.
Yes, yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Any other comments on this one?
This is Carrie Hearn. I apologize. I'm calling in from the road, so hopefully you can hear me.
We can.
Okay, great. The devil's always in the details, and so to the extent that those categories that Joseph Reed just laid out are part of the recommendation, I may add, in addition to rate comparisons in different customer classes, that there are, that analysis would include bill comparisons, right? So looking at average total bill costs in different customer classes as part of that suite of metrics for comparison in other territories. Thank you.
Understood. Thanks, Carrie. And I mean, we put a couple of examples in there, but the idea is broadly that the commission will look at our survey results and things like that and determine from there what areas to look at, and then the commission can be the ones to decide what's actually a fair comparison. That was the intent. Any other comments on this first one? All right. So we'll move to the second one. Commission should assess whether the current regulatory structure is aligned with the Commonwealth's mandatory clean energy and energy efficiency goals, identify potentially conflicting incentives. We had heard a few concerns in this area. You know, few stakeholders mentioned that you know, Dominion is not expected to reach its energy efficiency standard. We've talked about different incentives and how things may negate one another when it comes to some of these goals. So does anyone have any views on this one that they want to share? Yep, Joe.
Yeah, I guess my only comment was we maybe consider whether this is unduly narrow, and obviously the company is very focused on increasingly clean and achieving the energy efficiency goals where it's possible to do so. But I think the current regulatory structure also needs to be aligned with the Commonwealth's statutory, you know, priorities and practical priorities for reliability and cost-effective service, you know, reasonable rates. So I guess I would wonder whether this should be a little more broadly framed, whether it's aligned with the Commonwealth's interest in mandatory clean energy, energy efficiency goals, reliability, and affordable energy resources and energy security.
And we could, to the first part about, you know, we're talking about what's codified, that we can maybe change the word mandatory to codified there to be more specific. And in terms of the conflicting incentives, that was meant to incorporate things like reliability, cost. So we could just add those as, you know, the examples there, if that makes it a little more, if that tailors it to what you were thinking.
Sure.
Yeah. Hi, Glenn.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments, Larry. I was just reading that through, and I think Joe made a good suggestion there because it's got to be a balance, right? So I think we do need to maybe put some additional verbiage in that one that is aligned, but also balanced with the priority of affordability and reliability. There's a number of ways to hit the mandatory clean energy goal without making people be able to afford to pay their bills. So I think if we can rewrite that, have some of the balance in there, that would be great.
Yeah, I think we can add a little more specificity there because really that is meant to be incorporated within that recommendation. Does anyone else have any views on this one? All right, and any sort of language tweaks we discuss here this afternoon, we'll make sure we incorporate before we send out this survey so that you're seeing the updated versions. Yes, Laura.
One of the things that recommendation or what I heard, Larry, is that part of the inspiration for that recommendation was the concern expressed by stakeholders about the energy efficiency goals. And so it is important to notice that, you know, a lot of stakeholders are wondering whether or not is justifiable for the utilities to not comply with reasonable goals. And I think that should be reflected specifically, but we can provide specific feedback in writing by the deadline. And I think I agree with the previous with Director Davis and Mr. Reed about maybe identifying something more specific about affordability. because we want to identify, how the regulatory system create conflicts for the utility to pursue more affordable solutions, or the most affordable solutions, generally solutions that do not require capital intensive projects. So we agree with the inclusion of affordability, but we caution that energy efficiency was one of the main concerns of stakeholders.
Yeah, understood. Thank you, Laura. And then I see Victoria has written in the as well as raised in the chat some of the items from the study itself that do align with this recommendation. One point says the SEC should study harmonizing financial incentives created through regulation with the Commonwealth's energy policy goals. And then another one says that it should be making progress towards the Commonwealth's decarbonisation goals. So we are looking at the incentives, and I think that's the important one to remember when we're looking at these studies. We're mostly looking at the incentives. So I'm not sure if I take a feedback when it comes to the energy efficiency goals in this study. I think we want to focus on how do the incentives that are out there work? How do they support or negate achievement of energy efficiency goals? I think it's a separate issue, the one you raised, Laura, about whether, how or whether the utility is reaching those goals. Are there any other opinions on this one or comments? Okay, well, we'll tweak that language per the requests. And then the last recommendation on this page: Commission should review existing performance-based elements, assessing their efficacy in achieving the stated goals and identifying lessons learned for any future performance-based mechanisms. So, this came, we had this request from the group, and RMI give a good overview of their opinions on the current elements in the code. And this is just the recommendation that the Commission should really assess how the existing performance-based elements are operating. Any viewpoints on this one? Joe?
I would just say, Larry, this one is probably as close to a consensus recommendation as any of them. That is exactly what the commission should be doing pursuant to this resolution.
All right, great. We'll maybe put this one in gold in the final report.
Yeah.
All right. Any other viewpoints on this? Okay, then we'll move on to the next slide. So obviously, as we did our regulatory assessment exercise, the rate adjustment clauses were cited probably most frequently as an area of concern for the people who responded. So this recommendation comes from that. And we heard different views on that of how that could be addressed, whether through alternative means or through changes changes within a cost of service model. So this recommendation, the Commission should directly address RACs in their study and conduct comparative analysis on the costs and benefits to ratepayers and utilities of recovering investments through RACs, base rates, performance-based tools, or hybrid mechanisms. And then we had also mentioned, just because we'd seen a lot of feedback towards the end of the proceeding, interest in the fuel cost sharing. We'd mentioned that as a specific one to address. Reading it again, I'm not sure it adds what we have written here adds a great deal to what's already in the study. So, if people feel strongly to keep it in, we can add it to the survey, or if no one's thinks it's really adding anything, we can remove it at this point. But just does anyone have any viewpoints on this one? I see a few people in the chat saying they agree that this should be included. Any other views? Yes, Joe?
I know there was a good bit of discussion about this from some of the stakeholders. I would note that, how costs are recovered as among base rates, rate adjustment clauses, and fuel cost recovery. That's, if you go back early in the report and everything we've said as part of this process, that was not one of the PBR tools that was listed. From our standpoint, and we may be in the minority on this, but the structure for recovering costs that's laid out in the code is beyond the scope of this proceeding.
Well, our consideration here was, there is interest in recovering these items separately. And it seems like, to make a fair comparison, I agree the study is specifically about performance-based, I suppose, versus the existing model. But it seemed like we might be limiting the commission unnecessarily if we just say, in consideration of this, it's one or the other. We were thinking it would be reasonable to give them some scope to consider, what are the other options here that aren't necessarily PBR.
Well, but I guess the point of the resolution is to look at PBR tools, and this is not a PBR tool. Put it another way, I'm not sure the scope of the commission's inquiry here, as directed by the legislature, is to evaluate the various methods of cost recovery for utility investments that are contained in the code and make recommendations on any changes. And I don't want to get ahead of our fine commission or its staff, but I would expect that the commission would find that to be beyond the scope of what they're being asked to sound in on here, whether we should have racks or not. We have racks, that we've had them for 18 years. I just think that's beyond the scope of the legislatively directed inquiry here.
Joe, this is Glenn. If you can help me out really quick, because I see where you're going with this, and I kind of agree. But let me ask you a question: if we're looking at performance-based tools, and the group is asking for a comparison of using performance-based tools versus recovering through racks, asking for comparison. So wouldn't that come into play? Because you wouldn't want to make a decision without looking at all the variables that could be tweaked in that same world, I guess.
Yeah, and I lost you for a little bit there, Glenn, but I guess I'm drawing a distinction, which I hope you can appreciate, between, are there tools like PIMs, right? Like incentive ROEs or other financial incentives or performance incentives that you can use to, drive efficiency. Sure, that's absolutely a focus of this inquiry, and that's an established PBR tool. For the commission to go beyond that and say, we think you ought to change the whole cost recovery paradigm here and limit racks or increase racks, move costs to base rates or move costs out of fuel and into some other cost recovery vehicle. That's where I think we may be getting beyond the pale a little bit in terms of the request that's been made by the General Assembly.
That makes sense. So why don't we do this? So I do agree that we're not looking for the SEC to go and start suggesting, basically the recovering the cost methods and that sort of thing. But to the extent that they can opine the efficiency or the effectiveness or the affordability of some of these performance-based tools or other tools versus making changes in, let's say, recovering via racks, right? So we wouldn't want them to go and suggest, okay, you should go change these racks. However, if they see doing something is not as effective as if we just looked at the rack, they should point that out, right? Which would then be for a later discussion.
Thanks, Dan.
I mean,
And
I
would,
think it's
go
fair
ahead, Joe.
game to say, you know, are there features within the existing construct which could change to better incentivize performance? Yeah, I mean, of course they you know, and that's why you have like incentive ROEs and that sort of thing. But I think we may be largely on the same page.
Yeah.
That, you know, there's sort of limits as to what the commission has been asked to look at here.
Yeah, let's wordsmith that one, Joe. I think there's a reason why we kind of want it in there, but you're right. I think we maybe want to put some guardrails around it. So
Okay.
let us wordsmith that one a little bit.
Sure.
Yeah, and I see others in the queue, I'm sure, lined up to agree with you, Joe. I would say, you know, your point is well taken, Joe, that the commission will get to determine what they do in this final study. Stakeholders, you know, we can recommend, we cannot dictate. So if the commission decides something that comes from a recommendation is outside the scope, that will be in their discretion.
Yep, of course.
Thanks. Sorry, forgive me. Next up is Lena.
Yeah, I just want to say a couple of things about this recommendation and tie it back to one of the things we were talking about earlier, which is affordability. You know, we may have consensus. I don't know for sure, but I would guess we might have consensus in this group that affordability is important. But where we may not have consensus is what do we mean about affordability? And, you know, in hindsight, I wish we had, as a group, taken some time to talk about what do we mean about affordability? Affordability to whom and how do we define it? Because our last meeting, we had somebody reference a report about affordability and they defined it as rates, but didn't include the racks. And so here's an example, like others in this group would say affordability includes considering the racks. So I think this is why it's important that we include this recommendation, because if affordability is important, we need to be looking at the racks. And in particular, the question of what is a tool, what for performance-based rate making, this is still a developing field. There are still tools being created. Some of them are emerging. Some of them have not yet emerged. And fuel cost sharing is, you know, depending on how you look at it, one of those tools, because if a utility has to share the cost of fuels, they then will have this natural inclination to use less fuel, and that is then going to affect their performance, right, in the way that perhaps is aligned with the policies that that jurisdiction wants them to be aligned with, is use less fuel. So there we go. That's a built-in PIM. So I would say that that lower bullet point is important to keep in because it's one that this group talked about, and it is, sorry, I'm losing track of what all these acronyms are standing for, but a mechanism to impact performance. So I know we've been talking about this one for a long time, but I just wanted to say why this one's important for this particular stakeholder.
Thanks, Lena. And then Katja, you're next.
Yeah, thank you, Larry and Lena. I would echo your comments. And I think this is something that Director Davis hinted at early on, was that there is some value in, if we're going to be assessing, you know, the study recommendation says the commission shall provide an analysis of the current regulatory framework and the financial incentives such frameworks creates for investor-owned electric utilities. And so I think if we were to evaluate something like a multi-year rate plan, we couldn't properly assess and evaluate that without taking into consideration how RACs are operating in Virginia. And I think to your point, Larry, that doesn't mean that in this particular report or even in the SCC report comes out that there will be a robust discussion about exactly what should happen with those RACs and how they, you know, should be addressed, but rather more so I would say an acknowledgement of the outcomes that our racks could or could not be producing, and how that would need to be further looked at if we're assessing the usefulness of these other tools. And so I do think that it's relevant to this report. I think it was a considerable part of our conversation throughout the stakeholder process. And so, you know, I know that there was talk of wordsmithing. And so if it'd be helpful to just maybe like clarify that this was a topic of discussion and that's why it's being included, rather than a steadfast recommendation of something that, you know, something that explicitly has to be done, maybe that would be helpful. But I would hesitate to remove parts of it because I do think that it is really relevant to the assessment of our current system, as well as how it would be integrated with any potential tools that we'd be studying.
Gotcha. And Tanisha.
Hey Larry, I think my thoughts were just largely captured by Kaja and Lena. The other thing I would add is similar to what Lena was saying. I definitely think in our analysis of affordability, we're thinking about racks and rates, so would want this to be reflected. Similar to what Kaja was saying about how the legislation itself and was trying to make sure we're looking both at current system functions. And I think that this is, and we spent a lot of time talking about this in our stakeholder group. So I would think it'd be pertinent for the SEC to assess it. And as the recommendation is written here, it seems very like more of a general, asking them to generally take a look at the racks in addition to base rates, PBR tools, etc. So I'm a little bit concerned as to what additional specificity would need to go into it, because it's already fairly broad and neutral in my perspective. The other point I wanted to name is when I was listening to the Regulatory Assistance Project and RMI give us our presentations about the multi-year rate plans and decoupling, the cost trackers were definitely highlighted as key elements that needed to be looked at and assessed to make sure that if there is an issue, if we do want to go forward with it, that we're thinking about all the impacts therein. So I would hate for that to be ellipsed or absent from their assessment, so given that, as they discussed, it has a huge impact on where those tools can provide for affordability. So just wanted to flag that, support the recommendation as it is, and would want a little more details about when we say wordsmithing, what we're thinking here, because it seems pretty pertinent and important to stakeholders that have participated so far.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I don't know if Glenn, if you're available, would you be able to explain a little more about the guardrails you had in mind? He may have stepped away. I'll see if we can catch him.
Sorry, Larry. I just like to take a call. I'm back.
Oh, sorry, that we just we had a request if we could just have a little more clarity. You mentioned maybe adding guardrails to this one, and participants are just interested to hear what those might be, just understand how it might change the overall direction of the recommendation.
Oh, so I don't think we're looking to change the recommendation. If we're just to maybe clarify that we're not asking the SEC to go and look at what goes through RECs and how RECs are done, or racks and how racks are done. But we are looking for a comparative analysis on if they were to do, let's say, something with one of the other tools, how does it compare if they would have just done something with the rack instead? So to Joe's comment, we would not be asking them to start going down the route of should we change what's in racks and base rates, etc. More so just to do a comparative analysis. If they are looking at potential changes, how would it compare to maybe pulling a different lever related to a rack? But I don't think that shifts anything. I think it just puts a little bit of guardrails of what we're asking the SEC to do. We're asking them to do a comparative analysis in some cases, not asking them to go down that rabbit hole and start tweaking with things.
Understood. Does that clarify a little more for everybody?
Yeah, that sort of relates to the comment I was about to make. I do think it is important to look at the ratio of racks to base rates, what's in racks, what's in base rates as it pertains to PBR, because so many of the incentive mechanisms and other tools here may be differentially effective depending on how much is recovered through RACs and how much is recovered through base rates. We talked about, if we have a more holistic PBR framework, some of these things may be somewhat shielded by being in RACs. So I think it is actually important for them to look specifically at these and the extent to which they facilitate or don't being able to implement any of these performance-based tools.
Thanks. And Laura?
Thank you, Larry. I was just wondering, is there any other stakeholder present in this meeting that has a problem with this recommendation? Because I think I've just heard from Mr. Reed. And what we could do is just leave the recommendation as is, because if there is nobody else with a problem, and maybe Mr. Reed could offer, a clarificatory bullet point that you can, clearly state what's the position of the utility. But if there is no other stakeholder with a clear concern about the recommendation, I don't think it's fair to kind of jeopardize that nice recommendation that came out of the stakeholder process. So I'm curious to see if there is any other stakeholder with a clear kind of problem with the recommendation.
This is John with APCO. So we agree with Virginia Power on this, and I really disagree with your position on the report. I think the report should be clear to the commission on its surface. It shouldn't attempt to mislead the commission in any way as to who believes what, or what position belongs to what stakeholder and what position doesn't. So that's kind of what I said earlier. I'll just reiterate it again. I don't think the commission. I don't like to speak for the commission, but I just suspect if I was them, if I got a report that sort of misled me in some ways, I wouldn't be too happy about that. So I think everybody everything should just be as clear and upfront as possible in the report. That's all.
Thanks, John.
And I'll add one last thing. I hesitate to go down, the route of having the SEC play around with the RAC stuff through this. One, that's not really what we're trying to do. But secondly, I can share from a legislative standpoint, there's a significant interest from the legislators on RACs being transparent. And there's always been a lot of discussion about what should be in RACs, because that is transparent and the ratepayers know what they're paying for, as opposed to being sometimes stored in the rate bases. And at that point, the transparency kind of disappears. So I think that's another reason why I think the legislature would kind of like us to stay away from going down and pulling those levers.
Thanks. And Joe?
I fully endorse Director Davis's comments there. And I guess, and then I'll be quiet, just sort of playing off of John's comments as well. I mean, to me, look, there are a handful, I think it's a fairly small handful of stakeholders that have expressed some concerns about the RAC structure. I don't think it's a PBR related recommendation. I think it's beyond the scope of the PBR tools that we've identified. But, perhaps rather than this being a recommendation, it's sort of a footnote that, in addition, certain stakeholders believe that the commission should do this or address this with respect to RACs. But I don't think it rises to the level of a PBR related recommendation.
Okay, and forgive me, I've lost track of my number in here. Laura, you're next.
Yeah, I fully agree with Director Davis. I think in our comments, I think we put that one of the benefits of RACs is that they increase transparency. However, in our comments, we clarified that it is possible to keep the transparency positive aspect of RACs while fixing the disincentives for cost control that are inherent to RACs. And Mr. Reed, I think you were very wrong about RACs not being part of PBR, because if you were present in the discussions, the experts that Virginia Energy brought to the table talked about the importance of assessing the role of RACs in the regulatory structure. And if we take this, I don't think it's going to be productive if we take this recommendation out completely, because it is part of the law. The law says that the commission has to assess the current regulatory framework, and RACs are part of the current regulatory framework. So I don't think, Mr. Reed is right conceptually. That's just not wrong. If you Google what a RAC is an alternative regulatory tool, and that's part of the law. But yeah, I agree with Mr. Reed, and that should be part of the assessment that the commission does. Is like, what are the good things about RACs, transparency? How do we keep that while fixing the bad part of RACs?
Thanks, Laura. Noticed a couple of comments. Yep, Catch has put that language from the study that mentions the current regulatory frameworks and financial incentives. I mentioned there have been arguments that our reliance on RACs creates incentives to undermine other goals like affordability, as other stakeholders have described. Have Tanisha agreeing about the experts have brought up RACs a number of times, and opposing the footnoting of this suggestion. And then one last one from Victoria, just mentioned a performance-based regulatory framework would function very differently in a regulatory structure that folds large amounts of costs into RACs versus base rates. So it does seem like there's a lot of support for addressing this. So I'm going to suggest we maintain this as part of our survey, and we'll do the same thing where we'll just note who supports and who opposes it, or who supported it and who does not. Okay, any other comments on this one? All right. I think our next slide, please, Jonica, is removed from our current structure and is starting to think about which PBR or alternative tools we'd like to look at. And this came up in a number of the later submissions we had, this first recommendation, but that in its study, the Commission should clearly define the goals or objectives that informed its approach to evaluating performance-based tools. So I suppose those may come from the resolution, or they may have more specific goals. And in this mention, if future work is conducted in Virginia to develop alternative rate-making approaches, that should also be organized according to a targeted set of identified objectives. So first part focuses on this study, but we did hear some interest, and I suppose there is an expectation if we continue down the path of looking at performance-based regulation, there will be probably future studies and stakeholder processes. So just a consideration that those should be guided by just very clear identified objectives. Any comments on this? Okay, and then the second one here, this is more or less just a kind of reporting on what the surveys and comment letters highlighted, but suggesting, again, acknowledging the Commission, it has to cover everything in that very lengthy resolution, but it may have an ability to focus more on certain things than others, just deciding on how it manages its resources. But the recommendation then is the Commission should focus on performance incentive mechanisms, decoupling multi-year rate plans, the CapEx, OpEx equalization, and field cost sharing in its study, and then incorporate the other stakeholder recommendations into that analysis. Those other recommendations that kind of suggest how the study should be conducted. Any comments on that one? Yes, Lena.
It occurred to me as I was reading that because of the way the survey asked us to limit our responses, that a lot of us didn't choose, but I think one of the choices was scorecards. And as we selected PIMs, it's really hard to have a good PIM without basing it on scorecards and metrics. And so as I read this recommendation, it just feels like scorecards and metrics should be in there, because if we end up with PIMs without having a good foundation of knowledge about how do you define metrics, how do you have good metrics ahead of time, then the PIMs are not going to be well-founded. So this might be a big thing to add this late in the game, but I would just recommend adding those in to that list ahead of the word PIMs would be scorecards and metrics, or maybe just scorecards.
It was an interesting point, and maybe I don't know if any of our PBR experts are on the line, but I think we did have the explanation that it's sort of an escalation. You start with metrics, then scorecards, and then a PIM. So I don't know if in some respects, maybe the first two are embedded once you have a performance incentive mechanism, but I don't know if any of our PBR folks could speak to that. I'm not sure who's on the line today. Right. Well, maybe we don't have. Well, would there be any objection if we added scorecards and metrics? We could even maybe put them in parentheses beside the PIMs, because that they are all connected.
I think Joe's hand is up. Or is
Is that about this point, Joe?
Yeah, it was.
Oh, sure.
It was. I mean, I agree with the point that scorecards are a good idea, and obviously the commission is looking at that right at this very moment in an active docket. I think more generally, first of all, the top recommendation that is probably one where there's closer to consensus on as well. But on this bottom one, I guess it sort of raises the threshold question that I brought up at the beginning. This is a recommendation that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 particular PBR tools should be the focus of the commission's inquiry. And let's say we take a survey, some parties may think PIMS and scorecards should be a focus. Others may think, no, I don't like that. I like MRPs. I like this, I like that. And so are we going to really give them a list of 5 to the exclusion of others, and then have a survey result that says 5 people support this, 4 parties oppose it, and 28 didn't respond? I mean, it's not really a recommendation to the commission if that's the case, is it?
Well, it's a recommendation in that this resolution has an awful lot of items to cover. So the intention of a recommendation like this is to suggest that if the commission is trying to prioritize, things that it may employ more in-depth analysis or study in greater detail, trying to give them some suggested, and again, it's only suggested, direction on that.
Well, I mean, I obviously the commission will do what in its judgment it deems to be appropriate. I question whether giving them an ununited partial laundry list of things that they should focus on is the right outcome from this report and recommendations.
Okay. So next we have, forgive me, Patsa.
Yeah, I wonder if, sorry if you hear my dog barking in the background. I wonder if a more comfortable, like if Joe, you or the company or others would be more comfortable with an expression that of the stakeholders that actively participated, these tools were discussed most often or came out as common themes, and therefore are being suggested to the commission as a starting point, which I think is the intent of why they're suggested, just based on who participated, how frequently and how often they spoke up. And if that was more clearly articulated, would that make the company more comfortable with it being included in the report? I just kind of wonder, what would be a better articulation of what ultimately I think is reflective of what happened throughout the process was that we talked a lot about PIMs, decoupling, multi-year rate plans, fuel cost sharing, and those sorts of tools.
Yeah, I mean, I think you might be onto something there, and it's to the point that I was making, that I don't know that this is a recommendation, right? Is it fine to say many different, in somewhere in the body of the report, or um, towards the end of the report, many different tools were discussed. Of the various PBR tools, the ones that got the most discussion were A, B, C, D, and E, with a number of stakeholders focused on PIMs and scorecards and noting the commission's current proceeding along those lines. Others focused on MRPs, CapEx, OpEx, equalization, et cetera. To me, it's more of a description of the process and what was discussed, as opposed to, and what was important in terms of the level of discussion, as opposed to a recommendation.
I do want to clarify, if I can, is this list based upon the survey results, and these were the highest scorers?
That certainly factored in. I can't remember if it was exclusively based on that, because we did, appreciate that not everybody was able to reply to the surveys. We did also try, I think, and incorporate what we saw in various comments letters as well, or even just what we heard in discussions. Jonica, can you recall if this is
Yeah.
exclusively survey results?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, so in the survey, we had one question about interest on learning about some of those tools, and we had asked specifically about all the tools that were given in the legislation. So part of it is from there, but also, as Larry mentioned, through the discussions and comments, whatever we got the most picked up in.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, would others be interested in that? Well, forgive me. I'll let you speak first, Christian. I see your the last hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. I think my one point here is considering that we've made it through the stakeholder process and the commission is going to be conducting another report, that I would caution against offering certain tools as most favored nation type status for inquiry. I think the commission should have a fair consideration of a number of different tools, especially tools that perhaps did not receive significant attention among the group. Just only because of how this process is working, just to give everything a fair shake, for there to be a complete record. And I think to just ensure we're looking entirely at the universe here, and not necessarily saying these 5 tools are the ones that we think, or the stakeholder group has consensus on, as the ones that could be potentially most effective in Virginia.
Okay. Well, here's one possibility. What if we change this one? We could keep it here, but add it as more of a note and say, based on discussions, surveys, comments, these tools were addressed most frequently. I think for kind of similar to what Katja's language was, and we can leave it at that. That way, we show that we acknowledge that we have conducted surveys and done things. We've had our discussions. The interest has been focused on these, but maybe framing it slightly differently, that we're not suggesting it should be to the exclusion of anything else. Would anyone have any objections to that, Katja?
Yeah, no objections necessarily. I'm recalling kind of our earlier meetings where we talked about the purpose of this entire stakeholder process and the purpose of what we'd like to see out of the report. And I do feel like at the time, stakeholders did identify that it would be helpful to have an end result of this process be a set of kind of priorities or a roadmap for the SEC to help guide them, given that the language of the enabling legislation says that the stakeholder process is supposed to inform the SEC report. And so I guess, I understand if minds change and sentiments change now actually seeing it on paper, but I do think that that was one of the goals that we identified out of the stakeholder process, was to give Virginia Energy a sense of, what stakeholders were discussing, and then help guide the SEC report. And I feel like as a group, we kind of talked about that being a goal of this process. And so I'm just hesitant to deviate from that too much, considering I think that's how a lot of groups approached participating in this process, since we set that goal kind of early on.
Thanks, Katja. And I think your recollection of some of the goal discussions we had is correct. And then just Victoria has popped in the chat, I think, some language from the resolution that the such process had been the stakeholder process shall lead to the development and proposal of potential reforms to the current regulatory framework. So yeah, you could frame that as, or this recommendation is falling within that. But I'll ask you, I mean, would anyone have an objection if we change this to a note, and we'll include this, and we just described where our focus has generally been as a stakeholder process on these 5 items.
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry. I'll make sure that I'm clear.
Absolutely. So instead of saying a recommendation, we'll say the commission, should focus on these items. We'll keep the text here for the most part, but we'll change it to just really a note that identifies that in the process, through the surveys, through our comment letters, through our discussions, these were the areas that got the most attention or the most interest.
And just to clarify and add that we would also include scorecards and metrics in this list, I believe.
Right.
I think that would be okay. I just want to make sure it's not since this was a large bulk of the discussion, that it's not like a bullet point footnote to the report.
Understood. Yeah, I mean, I think we'd if we keep it in this same format, I think this would just, all we'd really be doing is changing that recommendation to a note, keeping a lot of the language, tweaking it slightly, so it's more about this is what the group was interested in rather than directing the commission, but it would still be there under the recommendations section. Okay. All right, we've got a few more to get through, but why don't we take a 5-minute break, and we can reconvene at 2:45 to finish it up. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I think if we could move one slide on, Jonica, next we'll get to performance incentive mechanisms. So it's a number of both our expert presentations that address these, and I think some of the stakeholder presentations that we had at times had some suggestions around PIMs. So recommendation here is the Commission should evaluate what PIM designs could materially affect positive outcomes in different performance areas, and then potentially focusing on the key areas identified by stakeholders in their surveys, comments, and discussions. So just asking the Commission there to kind of review the record when they're thinking about this. And then maybe the more important part of this recommendation is the second one. This we get a little more specific into some of the questions we had as the group was discussing these PIMs. As such an assessment should address the scale of the associated reward or penalty required to incentivize improved performance, clarify what other performance areas could be positively or negatively affected, and consider what measures could be put in place to guard against decreased performance in other areas. So thinking how to make the PIM effective and avoid it having any negative impacts or mitigating any potential negative impacts. So any viewpoints on this one? Okay, then we'll move on to the next one. That is the multi-year rate plan. So again, these were covered in a number of presentations. And so I think this first recommendation came from a discussion I seem to recall from the last meeting, but that the Commission should provide analysis of the relative performance of jurisdictions or utilities with multi-year rate plans compared to Virginia and other jurisdictions that employ the cost of service model. So there's some discussion about how to compare Virginia to others, because it's not just where your rates are, it's where they are moving inside a multi-year plan or inside the cost of service model. So we leave, how to do this to the Commission, but just that idea that they should dive into are these multi-year rate plans being effective where they're employed. Any comments on this one? Yes, Joe.
Larry, I don't know who from the staff is on the call, but I mean, I was confused by the terminology here, because a multi-year rate plan is a cost of service based rate model. It's just how far are you projecting into the future what the rate should be, and what features do you have for automatic adjustments and so forth. But I mean, it is a cost of service model, and as we've said a number of times, we do have a multi-year rate plan construct here in Virginia. It's just 2 years versus some longer period. But I don't know whether the staff felt that had any of that same questioning on this recommendation.
Yeah, no, understood, and that would be interesting. Maybe we've got our terminology wrong here, but there's some interest in moving to what we've been calling multi-year rate plans throughout this process. And I don't know if anyone has a more accurate way to describe what we currently have, to reflect the comparison we're trying to make.
I mean, and not saying that we agree with this recommendation because the company doesn't, but is the point here, should Virginia consider a longer multi-year rate planning period than the current 2-year model that applies to base rates?
I believe in essence it is. Again, I think what we've heard is 3 to 5 years, but I would be interested if anyone else is able to define this, if there was a way they would term Virginia's current model, or is it just the case that it's a number of years and maybe we just need to tweak this recommendation that, it's a comparison of jurisdictions that have 3 to 5 year rate plans instead of the biennial rate plans that we have here in Virginia, because we can certainly make that change.
I can't tell whether Ms. Pate or anyone from the accounting division is on the call.
Hey,
Brian.
this is Brian Pratt. I don't believe Kim Pate is on the call. I don't know what thoughts she may have, but I'll just speak from my perspective. I'll just say I don't want to necessarily speak for the department or other stakeholders as to what they believe they may be recommending with a multi-year rate plan, or if and how that may differ from our existing biennial reviews currently. I mean, I do generally agree we have a biennial review process for Dominion and APCO that encompasses a couple of different rate years. The extent to which stakeholders feel a multi-year rate plan is something beyond that or something materially different, I don't want to, I'm not sure I as staff would be in a position to comment on that, and I'd rather let the other stakeholders comment on how they feel about that. Hopefully that answers your question, Joe. If not, feel free to follow up.
No, I think it does.
Thanks, Brian. And I mean, if anyone else can comment on the terminology, please do. Otherwise, I mean, would it be acceptable to everyone if we do change that to a comparison of 3 to 5 year rate models versus the biennial?
I think this is Laura with Columbia, Virginia. Yeah, this one, maybe we can think about it a little bit more because it's a little complicated, because what we have, as we have discussed, is a system with a biennial review, but we also have a system where more than 50% of the costs are recovered through RACs, right? So it's not a purely biennial. It's not that all the costs are recovered in a biennial review. It's that we have a bifurcated, almost to describe it some way, we have a bifurcated model where 50% of the costs are RACs, 50% of the costs are base rates. So that's why it's so difficult to compare Virginia to other states where maybe the RACs are much more limited and much more newer, for example, or they only have the fuel factor and everything else is in base rates. Versus other states where they have what is called performance-based regulation models, when they use index to update costs instead of the utility forecasts. So yeah, this recommendation is a little bit complicated because it's hard to compare the Virginia specific model with other states that have completely different structures. So yeah, I just summarize what I said. I just wanted to clarify that when we talk about the Virginia model, we cannot only talk about the biennial review, but the other 50% of the costs about RACs. So yeah, I'm not sure how to go about kind of framing this in a way that could be helpful for the commission.
Thanks, Laura. I understand your point. A suggestion there is, if we provide analysis of performance of utilities with these multi-year rate plans, or maybe we'll define that as the 3 to 5 year multi-year rate plans, compared to the Virginia system, and we'll specify, the Virginia system as it is, because that then will incorporate base rates, RACs, and everything else. And then we could leave it there, or I mean, if we still would like a slightly broader comparison of, these MRP states versus others, we could say something like, and other jurisdictions that the commission deems appropriate. Does that thread the needle?
Yeah, somehow. So just to give you another example, there are states where they don't use multi-year rate plans, or RACs is just straight, cost of service, where the utility brings their case, every often, and they don't have these tools. So yeah, just we can wordsmith it a little bit to be more specific.
Yeah, so I think if we had other jurisdictions that the commission deems appropriate, then we could let them decide, which other models they want to bring in for comparison. But we'll definitely have that comparison of Virginia and the 3 to 5 year multi-year rate plan states. Any other comments on this, and does that sort of suggested language change work for everyone?
Yeah, maybe we could add, states with formula rate plans, because I mean the other thing that I think we heard from the experts that you invited was that one of the problems with RACs is that they bring the states to be similar to other jurisdictions where they use formula rate plans, and that has resulted in poor outcomes for customers. So I would say maybe it's not only states that use longer multi-year rate plans, but also states that use formula rate plans, and that will give us kind of an understanding of how the part of the costs that are recovered through RACs compared to or are similar to those jurisdictions that use formula rate plans.
Understood. Does anyone have any objections if we include, we'll have Virginia and then states with formula rate plans as well as one of the points of comparison?
I think I'd have to see it, in fairness.
Yeah, and I mean, and overall, the idea is just, states with multi-year rate plans, are they performing better, in ways that the commission can determine than Virginia? And then broadening that out, because obviously the more data points, more utility states you include in that analysis, you'll probably see a more robust result in terms of, trying to say what the benefits, if there are clear benefits to the 3 to 5 year models. All right. And the second recommendation on the multi-year rate plans, the commission in its evaluations of multi-year rate plans should provide analysis on the effects of incorporated investments currently recovered through base rates and RACs into the multi-year rate plan framework, including how this affects the proportionate risk borne by ratepayers and shareholders. I think that's something we've heard as we've gone through, and understanding the incentives is also understanding who bears the risk. Does anyone have any comments on this one? Yes, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, nothing beyond what we said before, which is that I think a discussion of totally changing the cost recovery framework in Virginia is beyond the scope of this directed analysis. I mean, basically saying get rid of the RACs and put it all into one big soup bucket of cost recovery through a multi-year rate plan.
Well, I would have to
That's
read
the way I'm reading it.
So yeah, I would have to read the resolution again, but I didn't think that the items under consideration had to simply be additive to what is there now. I think considering them as replacements for the current structure is also part of the study. Yes, Lena.
Yeah, just to agree with Larry that I would think that it was I had the same take as Larry, that as we've talked about from the beginning, as we've heard presenters from the beginning, that performance-based rate making can be anywhere along the spectrum, from adding incrementally to something more substantial, that includes decoupling, that includes a complete rethinking of what makes sense to get the results that make sense for the state, to be aligned with state policy goals. So I think it can be anywhere along a spectrum, according to the presenters that we've heard along the way.
Any other comments on this one? Yes, Kajsa.
Yeah, I would just quickly say that I don't think that I don't interpret this inclusion as a complete suggestion that this should and has to be the thing that happens. I interpret it more as an evaluation of whether it should be a potential thing that could happen or not. Yeah, I think that the intent of this is to get the SEC to, I think we have identified areas for improvement as stakeholder group and have identified potential paths to pursue. But I think the intention of these suggestions in this report is to also push the question to the SEC to ask if they identify any areas for improvement as well. And that will include evaluating the current tools that we have, because we can't really design better tools if we don't have a great understanding of the ones that currently exist.
Sketch. Any other comments on the multi-year rate plan recommendations? Okay, and we've just got a couple left to go here. I think next up is capital investments. So I think this was a concern we heard in different places. What was that the current model has, in some views, a capital bias, as in it incentivizes capital investments beyond potentially other solutions, on the whatever they may be. So the recommendation here, the Commission should compare the potential impacts of different alternative tools on capital investment and evaluate which existing or alternative mechanisms would ensure the most robust consideration of alternative solutions. So any comments or viewpoints on this one?
Yeah, I do think as written, I think I'm getting where it's going, but it does seem a little vague. I'm not totally sure what is meant by this.
Yeah, no, that's understood, because I think as we'd heard the concern about capital bias, there was what we'd heard in some comments was, potentially does this mean other options aren't as well incentivized? It might be more effective, more cost effective, things like operational changes, demand side management, things like that. And maybe we could specifically mention what we mean by alternative solutions. Just add a few examples after the period there.
Sure. And yeah, I mean, I think we should be clear, and I don't think any of the stakeholders were suggesting eliminate all your capital expenditures and put it all into these other different buckets. But I do think a little more specificity on what the alternative tools might be would be helpful.
Gotcha. Any other comments on this one? Okay, and I think we can move to our last one. And we call this regulatory dynamics, but as many of our presenters pointed out, and a lot of our questions revolved around, how does one PBR element interact with another? And some are complementary, some can be counteracted. It generally depends on the design. And so the recommendation here was that the Commission should examine which PBR tools would work together to effectively achieve key outcomes. So not just thinking of each one in isolation, also thinking how they interact with each other. And then a sub-bullet here, just recognizing that the Commission only have limited time, it could be appropriate to be selective in terms of which tools and outcomes to include in an evaluation. If this is the case, then it's recommended that the Commission focus on tools and outcomes that have been highlighted as key stakeholder interests. So again, just maybe some sympathy with the Commission's plight and how much they have to cover here. That sub-bullet was meant to suggest that they could sort of use the stakeholder record as a way to prioritize, which interactions to look at or which performance outcomes to focus on. So any comments on this one? Okay. Well, thank you. That's the last one we had written. And then if we go to our last slide in this area, just wanted to see if anybody else had any other recommendations that reflect the interest of the stakeholder group, based on our discussions and submissions. We've tried as best we can to kind of reflect the overall conversations this group has had, and just want to see, is there anything we've missed that anybody thinks would be worth including? Yes, Laura.
Hey, Larry, about the previous one, so the capital investments one, I think that's a very important one. So I think it's worth just clarifying, as Victoria mentioned, that maybe if you clarify the impacts of different regulatory tools on the optimal selection of investments, and evaluate which existing alternative mechanisms would ensure the most robust consideration of all resource alternative solutions. So I think that's what you mean here, is like, how do we ensure that utilities are really given thorough consideration to non-capital intensive solutions? And that's kind of what I think this part is referring to. So maybe if you could clarify that recommendation a little bit more, I think it will be helpful.
Yeah, we can do that. Jonica, would you mind just going back to that slide? And Laura, if I could ask you just to repeat the part at the start where you had some suggested language tweaks. Just want to make sure if we do change language that it's something everybody's agreeing on. I think you're still muted, Laura, if you're speaking.
Hey, I don't see this slide. Is it up?
It is up now, yes, so we can all see the recommendation as it is.
Oh, sorry, can't see it for some reason, but it might be my layout. So yeah, it says the Commission should compare the potential impact of different alternative tools. So, I mean, I guess you are referring to different alternative regulatory tools.
Yes. So we should say that more specifically, kind of
I think the problem is that you're kind of repeating yourself there, but if you start from the second part of the sentence, you say evaluate which existing all alternative mechanisms, I think you are referring to regulatory tools again, would ensure the most robust consideration of all alternative resources available, maybe to meet demand. But yeah, I think you're talking about the same thing in those two parts of the sentences. So I think the core of the recommendation is evaluate whether there are alternative regulatory tools that would ensure that the utility give robust consideration to all available resources. And so that's why I think in the previous bullet point, you refer to CapEx and OpEx equalization, meaning making other type of expenses equally attractive to the utility to meet the need, and all source competitive procurement as a way to really ensure that all alternatives are equally compared when it comes to a decision of how we're gonna, develop the electric system. So yeah, I think a little bit more wordsmithing will be worth it.
Yeah, no, I take your point, and I think Victoria has some recommendations here. Should evaluate whether non-capital expenditure tools are underutilized to meet electricity demand, decarbonization goals, and ensure reliable service. Another option would be, I mean, can we, maybe we don't need the first part of the statement. Maybe to Laura's point, it is a little duplicative. And we could focus on that latter part, which is about asking, do these existing or alternative mechanisms, would they better incent whatever the optimal mix may be? Does that sound about right to everybody? Okay. Well, I think yeah, we can work in that. We'll get something out in the survey that's closer to what we've discussed here. All right. Go ahead, Joe. I think you're still muted, Joe, if you're speaking.
Sorry about that. Having gone through the list, I guess the only other thing that I wonder, as you think about what would the General Assembly want to see from the commission, might be a recommendation, is a discussion of those jurisdictions outside of Virginia that have engaged in broad-based PBR initiatives, and sort of what have the success or less than success stories been in terms of regulatory outcomes, customer rates, decarbonization priorities, etc.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I would just add, I think it is important for the commission to look at energy bills as a whole, as opposed to just rates in evaluating efficacy.
Yeah, well, you use more energy, like you do in the South, you're going to have a higher total energy bills, which is unrelated to a lot of these priorities. But I mean, I understand you're talking about energy efficiency, I assume specifically, but I would disagree that total energy bills versus rates is what you should be looking at.
And I will suggest, maybe when writing this, I mean, assuming others are interested in adding this, look at other jurisdictions, we could refer specifically to the performance areas in the resolution. And obviously that gives affordability for customers.
Yes.
Which I think then gives the commission the latitude to decide how to determine that. Victoria?
No, I'm removing my hand. I think affordability for customers is fine.
So would everyone agree with that as another, and you can jump down to the other section there, Jonica, just as another, we'll just recommend the the commission evaluate how jurisdictions that have engaged in broad-based performance-based rate making. So I'm thinking those ones like Hawaii and a couple others that have really gone far down this road.
Yeah.
Connecticut,
California.
Yeah, how they compare in the performance areas outlined in the resolution.
I'm afraid that that's very similar to one of the recommendations we already worked through, where it says multi-year rate plans. The commission should provide analysis of the relative performance of jurisdictions or other utilities with MRPs compared to Virginia and other jurisdictions that employ the cost of service model.
Yeah, maybe you take it out of that and just make it a broader recommendation.
Yeah, I think we may want to work on like a recommendation about how to compare Virginia with other jurisdictions and what kind of could be a fair comparison. I think there is a lot of, questions about how to, what's a fair comparison. But
yeah, well, I mean, would Joe's suggestion work if we essentially swap out our multi-year rate plan comparison for this more broad-based suggestion?
yeah, I mean, and maybe we can, to the question of how do we see the results of, that, again, 50% of of the utilities cost are being recovered through RACs, which is a specific model. So we could see, states that have adopted a similar approach, where that has resulted as well. So
I
yeah,
see.
to
So
the
not
extent
just,
that is possible.
so are you suggesting not just the comparison of Virginia to these advanced PBR states, but also comparing other jurisdictions, getting a slightly broader base of comparison, having some, I think the term used earlier was formula rate plans, maybe mentioning that as well,
Yeah.
as other points of comparison. Yeah.
Yeah, I already suggested that, yeah.
Okay. So does that work for everyone? We'll sort of broaden that recommendation on jurisdictions from the multi-year rate plan and pull it in as a separate one.
Yeah, and I think Laura's suggestion is probably a good one, that the commission should sort of benchmark us versus advanced PBR states and include looking at, jurisdictions as well with a more traditional cost of service regulation based model in terms of affordability, reliability, decarbonization, energy security.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think we can work that up pretty quickly. Just any other comments on that suggestion? Okay, and then any other suggestions for recommendations?
Yeah, I would just clarify that we don't have a traditional cost of service. We have, a different model. Again, the biennial.
I agree with
the,
you.
Yeah, okay. The biennial review and the RACs just puts us in a sui generis model that is kind of very particular.
Yeah, we'll refer to it as something like the regulatory framework in Virginia, so that everybody knows we're looking at our own special way of doing things. Do you have a comment, Joe?
No.
Oh, sorry, I'm mute. Any other recommendations, suggestions? Okay, well, thanks everyone for contributing to the discussion. We'll wrap these into a survey and send out this afternoon so that everybody can clearly identify what their position was in each recommendation, and we'll incorporate that into the final report so it's nice and clear. With that, I think we will move on to just finishing out for today. So Brian Pratt from the SCC is going to guide us through the remainder of the process for the overall SCC study. So I'll hand over to you, Brian.
Thanks, Larry. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'll be real brief. I know we're getting late in the afternoon, but just wanted to highlight kind of a broad brush of kind of how the torch is going to be handed over from the department to the SCC from this point forward. I guess, Janica, if you don't mind moving on to the next slide, I think we'll start there. So some of you folks may know this, but the commission has opened a docket, which is case number PUR 2024-00152. That docket has been established in conjunction with our report and in conjunction with this stakeholder process. Janica, you probably move to the next slide for me. So in conjunction with that, the commission issued an order establishing proceeding back on September 24th, which established that docket. And essentially the whole purpose of that proceeding is really just to facilitate coordination between the department and this stakeholder process and the commission's study. Specifically, that order kind of established two foundational activities. Number one, requested the department to file a summary of its stakeholder process, including a report of its stakeholder findings and recommendations in the case docket. I believe the date for that submission was initially requested to be back in February, but the department requested an extension to that. So that submission date is now May 9th, 2025, as extended. And then the second thing the commission's procedural order established is a directive that there would be an opportunity for interested persons to comment on department's summary as filed in the docket or other matters related to the commission's study. Importantly, the date for that comment period has not yet been set. There will be a subsequent commission order that sets forth the deadline for that comment submission and other related instructions. I think you could probably move forward to the next slide, Jonica. So last and final slide, I just want to give a quick overview of just kind of the summary of the timeline moving forward for us. First, as I stated, the commission will receive and post the department's summary of the stakeholder process and the department's report of its findings and recommendations from the stakeholder group. That'll be posted in the case docket on May 9th, 2025. At some point subsequent to receipt of the department's report, the commission will issue an order providing a deadline and other instructions by which interested persons can file comments in the docket on either the the department's report or any other matters pertinent to the commission's study that interested persons wish to comment on. And then, over the course of the next several months, commission staff, in conjunction with our consultants and subject matter experts that we have retained with GPI and Current Energy Group, will be authoring and conducting our study, and that study will be informed in part by this department-led stakeholder process and in part by any additional comments that we receive from interested persons in the commission's docket. And then ultimately, we have a couple of deadlines for the commission study that have been set forth in the joint resolutions. First, we are required to submit an executive summary and report of the commission's findings and recommendations to the governor and General Assembly by October 15th later this year. And then second, the commission, in collaboration with the department, will present the commission study's findings and recommendations to the General Assembly on November 15th, 2025. So it's just a general overview of the timeline going forward. I guess I'll just pause there. Those are, I guess, next steps from the commission's angle here. Are there any follow-up questions from the group related to that? Katja.
Hi. Yeah, hi, Brian. Thanks for that overview. That was really helpful. So for future opportunities to participate or be involved in the study process, will they mainly be conducted through public comment filings in the docket?
At this time, that is what's been set forth in the commission's order. So there will be an opportunity for public comments. At this time, I don't think we envision like a separate commission stakeholder process or anything of that nature, if that's what you're referring to, but there will be an opportunity for comments in the case dockets to be received, and that will all go into the evidentiary record by which we can use to construct our study.
Great, thank you.
Question?
Yep, perfect.
Absolutely. Any further questions? Okay, I think I'll hand the torch back over to you, Larry.
All right, thank you, Brian. And we'll just close out here with the next steps from us. So it was one, now two homework assignments, I guess, last homework assignments. If you could send us any, as you're reviewing the report, any comments on inaccuracies in the draft report by the end of the day on Thursday, we'll make sure, everything is accurate as regards stakeholders' positions and what each individual said. And then the second thing, we will work in this survey. We'll get that out to you today as well, where we'll have the recommendations listed and have the option of, agree, disagree, and no opinion, and we'll make sure that's reflected in the final report. Any questions on either of those activities? All right. And then, so we're submitting our report, it goes to internal review here for a couple of weeks, but then we'll get it to the SCC by May 9th, and we'll make sure that the final version is circulated to all the stakeholders. So appreciate you doing those last couple of assignments and giving us our last meeting. Just wanted to thank everybody for all the effort that has been put in. I know it's taking a lot of resources from everybody involved to be able to contribute over this time, and challenging when we were in the midst of the General Assembly as well. So really appreciate all the time and effort people gave to put in some really good input. And with that, we'll close it out for today. Thank you.
Thanks very much.